The third quick performance win for Laravel we're going to cover is the config cache. So if we do PHP artisan config cache-h, we'll see it creates a cache file for faster configuration loading. Now, we might want that because there's actually quite a few config files for Laravel to parse through. And in addition to the ones we see out of the box here, you might have some of your own that you've created. There might be some for third-party packages that are either set in the config folder here or are hidden inside of a service provider. So one kind of easy layup thing for Laravel to do is to just cache the results of all of the configuration. And this includes the stuff set in your .m file. So what Laravel is going to do when we run the command is, well, a few things. We can see it here. So the config cache command is the file that's open right now. We can see it's going to do a few things. It's going to config clear, so it's going to clear out the cache here. It's going to get a fresh configuration. This is the main meat of it. It's really compiling all the configuration together into one place, into one large PHP array. And then it's going to save that to a file as var export, which is actually a PHP readable format, right? So var export is a function that's going to export a string that is actually readable as PHP. So if we have a huge array here, the config array is going to return it as a string, and that is something that just gets saved to the file using this file puts with the Laravel file system package. This is the get cache config path. That's where it's going to save it, which is actually the bootstrap cache directory again. So let's actually go ahead and run that. We'll see it's created. We'll head in our bootstrap cache directory. We see config is here, and we see it has all sorts of good stuff, including things that are only in the .m file, like the key here. So if I go to .m, we'll see that's the same key that's here, and the same thing with the DB connection and DB port, all that good stuff. Now, it didn't actually read the .m file. What it did see is that inside the config, for instance, for the application config, we'll see the application key is using the env function. And specifically for the key here, that's env app key, which is going to read the .env file. So the config cache command is actually only reading the config PHP files, but because some of those call the env function here, which is going to grab from .env and a few other sources, it's going to get values from those files as well, but not directly. Let's check out the documentation for this real quick and see for configuration caching, there's a big red area. If you execute config cache command during your deployment process, you should be sure that you are only calling the env function from within your configuration files, not from your code files. Because if you start using env inside of your code file, so for example, if I go into app HTTP controllers, my home controller, and inside of my home page here, so if I call env and some value, whatever that is, that might be set in your .m file, but this is going to return null with that config cache. The reason it's going to do that is because the env function is actually going to be looking in your config cache for something instead of in your .m file. So what you should do is add anything you might need, and as an environment variable, you should have that as a config value somewhere. So if we change this to config, some config my value, you can have some config file called some config. That could return an array with some value equals env some value. So you could have this some value defined in your .m file, which in turn would get sucked in to some config. Whoops, I have the wrong syntax there. Which could in turn become the value for some value here inside of your configuration, named some config, and then that would make this work here instead of the env function call. So what we want to do is make sure we use config function calls inside of our application code instead of env function calls. You still can use env, but you should only use them inside of your configuration files here so that the config cache properly sucks them up and sets them in the configuration cache file. So like I said, that configuration cache is in bootstrap cache, it's in here, and it's basically just a huge PHP array of all the configuration items and values compiled into one location. And of course, as I mentioned, this is a little bit faster on every page load, so it doesn't have to load so many config files and combine them and merge them and all that good stuff, including reading from the .m file. They're all in one place automatically. We don't have to do any file parsing, and that's a lot quicker in every page request. Now, the same caveat as the route caching applies to config caching. We don't want to necessarily use this in development because if you make a lot of config changes or any config changes, they're not necessarily going to get pulled up automatically by your application. So you don't really want to do this while in development. If you do by accident, there is a command to clear that cache. Of course, you could just delete the config cache file as well, and then that'll just pull from your config files and your .m file as you would expect and want it to. The last thing I'll show you here is our deploy script. We can just add PHP artisan config cache, and that will recache our configuration items again as well. And you could even, if you wanted to, remove the .m file, because in theory that won't be read anymore if you're using the config cache and you're not calling the m function from within your code anywhere. I don't know if I necessarily recommend this. Either way, you're going to have stuff in plain text inside of either your cache config.php file or in your .m file. This includes your secrets and your passwords and all that good stuff. That'll be in plain text there on the server anyway. So whether or not you want to delete that is up to you. It doesn't really change much. I don't typically delete the .m file. Because if the config cache disappears for some reason or gets deleted or cleared out, you still want the .m file there so that the Laravel application continues to run, because it'll still need to find the stuff in the .m file if there's no config cache to pull from.